Hi, I'm Athena Aktipis. I'm an assistant professor in psychology. I'm also the director of the Cooperation and Conflict Lab, the co-director of the Human Generosity Project, and the co-founder of the International Society for Evolution, Ecology, and Cancer. Now, I know that seems like a lot of different things, but really I'm one thing. I'm a cooperation theorist. I work on understanding cooperation across systems. So everything from how humans share to how cells evolve to share in the evolution of multicellularity and how that breaks down with cancer. But today I'm going to talk about one piece of my research. I'm going to talk about how humans help each other in times of need and what this means about human society, but also more generally what it means for other forms of life. So let's start by talking about an example from human society. The Maasai are a group who live in East Africa. They're pastoralists, which means they have herds and they rely on these herds for their survival. They drink the milk, they eat the meat, and in general, their whole livelihoods are tied up in their pastoral way of life. Now, the Maasai, they have a really interesting system of sharing that they use that I'm going to tell you a little bit about. So one of the things that you have to know is that they live in an ecology that is really variable from place to place. So some live in the valley, some live on the mountaintops, and the level of rainfall is very different in these different areas of the Great Rift Valley. And so what this means is that sometimes one herder might have enough grass and other vegetation to feed his cows in the area where he lives, while another might not. And there's also a lot of variation over time because they have 2 rainy seasons and 2 dry seasons every year. So the ecology fluctuates a lot. They also have other shocks. So the herd growth can vary because of these differences in the ecology, but there's also disease and theft also. So there's a lot of reasons why the Maasai potentially need to depend on each other for help because there's a lot of volatility in how many cows they have and whether they have enough cows to feed their families. So the Maasai have a system called Osotwa. And there are 2 main rules that go with Osotwa. One is that you're only supposed to ask for help if you're genuinely in need. And the other is that if you're asked for help, then you give, if you're able. So if you're asked but you don't have enough to help, then you're not expected to help. But if someone asks you to help and you have enough to help, then you help them. Now, Osotwa actually means umbilical cord in Maasai, which is pretty interesting because it is this metaphor for a mother giving to her child in the womb. And we know that that's often a one-way process, parents helping their offspring. And so even the metaphor, the language that they're using to talk about this system of helping in times of need is really clear that the giving is happening from the one who's able to help to the one who is in need. And there's not an expectation of return, which is really interesting because a lot of the work that has been done looking at cooperation has thought that it's necessary for there to be a payback in order for cooperation to be able to evolve and to be able to be stable. But with Osotwa, there's explicitly no expectation that there will be a return of that, there will be a payment or repayment. Now, there can be a mutual obligation in the future to help in times of need, but there is not an account-keeping expectation of paying back a debt. So this idea of Osotwa is actually there's a more general principle that we can talk about, which is need-based transfers. And Osotois is one example of a need-based transfer system. It's one that we've studied in the Human Generosity Project. In fact, the Maasai Osotois system was the first system that we really looked at in depth in the Human Generosity Project, and you could even say it was maybe an inspiration for the project as a whole. So let's talk about what need-based transfers are. You start with a request. Now, the request doesn't necessarily have to be explicit. It can also be implicit if you're otherwise making it known that you have a need. Among the Maasai, it's always explicit, but some of the other field sites that we look at, sometimes the request is implicit. You're just making someone aware that you're in need. So there's a request that's made, and that request is always limited to what's needed, and it's only made if you're in need. So that's the first step, is we have this request. The next step is that the person who is asked has the potential to respond. And they grant that request as long as they have enough to help the individual who asked without going below their own threshold for what they need. So this, in a way, serves to protect the person who's the helper, because they're not expected to just give everything that they have if that puts them at risk. They only give to the point that they're able to without themselves being in need. And as a result of these two rules, what you get is some pooling of risk, but it's a limited pooling of risk because the giver is not taking on all of the risk of the individual who is asking for help, because they limit their giving to just what they can give without themselves being in need. And this gives risk pooling between these partners, and that can enhance survival. And we have found through computer models that this need-based transfer rule increases the survival of the partners who are using this rule far above what these partners could do if they were using a standard debt credit paying back kind of system. So to us, this is really interesting that such a simple rule, and one that actually seems sort of vulnerable to individuals maybe trying to cheat it, that it actually can do really well in these computer models. So let's expand our frame a little bit now. We talked about the general features of need-based transfer systems. Well, in the Human Generosity Project, one of the things that we are looking at is these need-based transfer systems across societies. We have societies around the world who are part of the Human Generosity Project, and so far, in every society that we've looked, we've found need-based transfer systems. The Maasai have the Osotois system, which really was the inspiration for the project as a whole. In Fiji, they have a system called Keri Keri, which is also a need-based helping system. Many hunter-gatherers, including the Hadza in Tanzania, have central place food sharing, where they'll bring extra food that they foraged back to camp and share it with others based on need. Here in Arizona, in the desert Southwest, ranchers who live in really rural areas have a system called neighboring, which is also a need-based transfer system. And in urban Tanzania, there's a system called shiriki, which is, again, a need-based transfer system. So across all the societies that we've studied so far, we see examples of people helping each other in need, either in the moment when those needs arise, and also sometimes in preparation for difficult times. Like we have a field site in Mongolia where families will help each other prepare for very difficult winters so that they're more protected when those difficult times come. Now, need-based transfers are not just limited to humans. There are a lot of other species that use need-based transfers, it turns out. We talked about the Maasai and their livestock sharing system, other societies that have food sharing systems. And there's also a really interesting case of vampire bats. So vampire bats are often held up as a paragon of reciprocity because they preferentially share blood with previous partners who have shared blood with them. But it turns out, if you look back at these original studies, that the biggest predictor of one bat helping another is not their previous history of interaction, but rather how hungry the asker is, how hungry the bat is who is asking the other bat for blood. So this is really interesting because it suggests that things that might at first look like they're about account keeping, that one of the important drivers of that behavior might actually be the need of the recipient. And social insects, they also have need-based transfer behaviors. There's a phenomenon where an ant who's been out foraging will come back to the nest, and they'll have consumed food while ant that's in the nest will be hungry. And so the hungry ant will tap the antenna of the full ant who just came back from foraging, and then that full ant will regurgitate some food for the hungry one. So again, a need-based transfer system. Need-based transfers are also essential to who we are as multicellular beings. Each of us is made of about 30 trillion human cells that are collectively functioning to gather resources and store them and make us do all the things that we do as a multicellular body. But underlying all of that is a need-based transfer system where the cells in our body that need certain nutrients signal to nearby cells and even cells further away to provide them. That's the basis of our circulatory system, and the way that our vascular system works is this dynamic system where it's constantly responding to signals from cells and regions of the body where there is greater need for nutrients. So how can we kind of bring all of this together into a larger framework? Well, one of the things that we've been working on in my lab is getting a better understanding of the evolutionary reasons why need-based transfers can sometimes do so well in these models. And one of the things that we've realized is that there are a lot of situations where individuals are very interdependent, and they can only get good outcomes if another individual also gets good outcomes. So this is the case with partners in a Maasai-Osotwa system. It's often the case in families where two people may have common interests in their offspring. And in really dire situations like times of war, people's outcomes are very much tied to each other's because they're literally dependent on each other for survival. So we've defined fitness interdependence as the degree to which two or more individuals are influencing each other's success and replicating their genes. And one way that you can think about this is like we're all on this giant Ferris wheel or a set of Ferris wheels where some of us are in the same car. So we have good outcomes when our best friend or our partner or somebody else is having good outcomes, and we have bad outcomes when they have bad outcomes. And then in that situation, you have perfect positive fitness interdependence. I can only do better if you do better, and vice versa. But then you can have the opposite, where you have complete negative fitness interdependence. So that's like the two red figures in cars 9 and 3. When one goes up, the other goes down, and vice versa. And that's complete negative fitness interdependence. And then you can have variations on this where you maybe have partial positive interdependence. And you can also have no fitness interdependence, like the green figures, where what happens to me has no impact on what happens to you. Now, when we're in the same car in this Ferris wheel or in the same figurative boat, the only way that we can do better is by helping our partner do better. And so this helps to resolve some of the paradox of why we might see these need-based transfer behaviors all across human societies, across many other forms of life, and even inherent in our cellular sociality. So one of the things that we're really concerned about in the Human Generosity Project is applying some of our findings now to real-world issues. And that is focused largely on questions around whether we can help make better systems for resource management using need-based transfer systems as a model, and also can we improve disaster response and disaster recovery through an understanding of need-based transfers. There's also other interesting applications to better understanding charitable giving, understanding how we might be able to actually improve insurance systems by leveraging some of the knowledge that we're gaining from looking across societies, because ultimately insurance is about managing risk. And these societies around the world that we're studying in the Human Generosity Project have lots of ways of dealing with risk that maybe haven't been considered in standard market insurance systems. We're also interested in general questions about how economic transaction systems work. So one thing that's really interesting to me about the Maasai is they have this Osotoa system, which is based on need, but side by side with that, they have an account-keeping debt credit system. So that means I could, if I were Maasai, I could go up to an Osotoa partner and ask them for 5 cows, and they wouldn't expect me to pay them back if it was in the context of our Osotoa relationship. But I could go to that same person and say, actually, can I borrow 5 cows? I don't really need them, but I kind of want them. And then I would be expected to pay that back. So somehow these two systems are coexisting, and they're navigating between them and using these different systems in different contexts. And some of the other fieldwork that we've done in Arizona actually suggests that when outcomes are really uncertain and uncontrollable, that people may revert to a need-based system, while when outcomes are more controllable and predictable, they use more of a debt and credit system. So we're really interested in the Human Generosity Project in understanding that better and understanding when one system it makes more sense than another for us as individuals, but also for helping to manage risk for society as a whole. Another topic that we're interested in is applying these ideas of need-based transfers to understanding interactions between parents and offspring, which maybe you could kind of guess because Osotoa actually means umbilical cord, and so the whole idea of need-based transfers is really wrapped up conceptually in parent-offspring interactions. And we suspect that this psychology of helping others in times of need probably originally evolved in the context of parent-offspring interactions. And then it's sort of been co-opted for all of these other contexts where there is fitness interdependence. And it's allowing for risk pooling and other things that provide an advantage. In the Human Generosity Project, we're also very keen to communicate what we're doing with the rest of the world. So we have a website and a blog that's humangenerosity.org. We have a Twitter account, so we try to send out on Twitter our new papers and our new findings. We hold workshops. We have a really exciting exhibit at the Exploratorium Science Museum in San Francisco, where you can actually come up to this kiosk and play an Osotoa-like game. We call it the survival game, and there can be up to 4 players, and you have a herd that you have to manage, and if your herd goes below a certain threshold, eventually you die unless you are able to get cows from one of the other players. And this exhibit has been wildly successful at the Exploratorium. The typical amount of time that people spend at exhibits is like a minute, and sometimes we have people at this exhibit for 20 minutes and they're just really engaged in it. So to us that suggests that what we're looking at with this need-based transfer idea is really tapping into something fundamental. It's resonating with people in an important way. And we're actually in the process now of analyzing some of the data that we've been collecting from the exhibit at the Exploratorium to look at how it matches up with the behavior of people in the lab, where we've had them play similar games to this survival game. At ASU, we also run a version of this survival game at Open Door and other outreach events. So that concludes my presentation, but I just want to leave you with a few thoughts. One is that what we're seeing in the Human Generosity Project is that need-based transfers seem to be part of the human behavioral repertoire. Now, they're not the only thing humans do. Humans also will track debt and credit, and they can do both of those things, like the Maasai do, even in the same relationships, just in different contexts. So when I see that, when I see what we're learning in the Human Generosity Project and how these different societies around the world use need-based transfer systems and debt-based transfer systems, sometimes in these different contexts that seem really appropriate, it makes me wonder, are there opportunities that we have to better leverage sort of more diverse set of economic transaction systems to deal with some of the different problems that we are encountering now and that we will encounter in the future? So just keep in mind that we all need a little help once in a while. So if somebody reaches out to you, it's a good idea to often lend that helping hand. Thank you.